first question today is from Sabrina on Patreon.
What does good emotional health look like, and what's the best way to achieve it?
Susan, so in your book, there on page 59, you talk about the good news about bad moods.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want to talk about this. And we were talking about it a bit on the Maximal episode, which we already recorded, how unfortunately we moralize everything. Happiness is good and sadness is bad and anger is bad, but bliss is good. And what you've done, especially with this book, I'll hold it up here. It's called Emotional Agility. And what you've done in the book is you've helped separate that moralizing of every emotion, because it's not merely about experiencing only the pleasurable emotions, the good emotions, and then shunning the bad emotions. In fact, we had a question about grief and how grief can be loving and beautiful and necessary.
Yeah.
And yet we're often just looking for the good. In fact, it's even in this question, what does good emotional health look like? And I'm reminded of a mystic I heard. Someone asked him if he gets angry. And he said, it's not that I'm not capable of anger, but I don't give anyone the privilege of making me angry. And it was this morning, Ryan said something, and he was like, am I frustrating you? And I was like, you don't have the power to frustrate me. Only I have the power to frustrate me. Only I have the power to make me angry. Only I have the power to make myself upset. Now, of course, our environment affects us in different ways, but generally it has to do with the expectations we set. And then when the environment doesn't comport with our expectations, that's when we feel those negative emotions.
Yeah. There's this beautiful quote, which is expectations are disappointments waiting to happen.
Ooh,
and I love it. I love it.
Yes, tweet that.
I actually don't know it's not mine. I don't know who it's from, but I spoke about a bit in the book. Yeah, I mean, the traditional way of dealing with, and it connects with this question, our emotions, is that they're good or bad, positive or negative. And this is a rigid view that is not true to the reality of our experience. I mean, Charles Darwin described how all of our emotions help us to communicate with ourselves. What are my needs? What do I care about? What are my values? And others. What are their needs? What are their values? And so on. And so a really important part of emotional health is moving away from hustling with whether you are or aren't allowed to feel something. And instead facing into the fact that you do feel it. In Emotional Agility, I talk about how acceptance is the prerequisite to change. And it's this remarkable paradox that we have in our own lives. It's like only when you face into the reality of what is, that you can move forward into what could be. And when I say acceptance, I don't mean passive resignation. I don't mean like, oh my goodness, I'm sad now. I don't feel like getting out of bed and there's nothing I can do, therefore I'm going to stay in bed. I don't mean passive resignation. I mean acceptance of what is. Only when we face into a world in which people are unseen and we accept and recognize that, we can actually start changing it. Only when we accept that climate change is a fact and we recognize that reality will always have its way, that we are able to change that. And so, you speak about anger. I'm reminded, my South African accent. So I grew up as a white child in the white suburbs of apartheid South Africa. And it was very much a country and a community committed to not seeing other people's pain, to not seeing and to denial. And I found so remarkable in that context the words of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela had a remarkable relationship with his anger. And what he described is how, firstly, his anger helped him to connect with what he cared about. So I would actually suggest that anger is a very, very important emotion. There is no change that has ever happened in our communities or in our society without anger. Yeah. Okay? So anger is crucial. But one of the things that Charles Darwin, Charles Darwin. One of the things that Mandela described is how it was the recognition of his anger and what his anger was signposting about his values that then, in his words, enabled him to sit down with his oppressors. And I think this is remarkable, and it's worth giving pause to, because a core part of my work is the idea that emotions are data. Emotions are data. Emotions tell us what we care about. But emotions are not directives. All right. And this is really important. Just because I feel angry doesn't mean I get to have it out with anyone, doesn't mean I get to act with impunity. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like if we can kind of step into our emotions and we can say, what are the data that these emotions are signposting? What is being threatened here? What value that's important to me is being threatened? So we can use those data, but we aren't letting them be directives. We are, instead of letting that anger hold us, we are instead stepping into our values. So the emotions are data, they're not directives. What are the directives? Our values, our wisdom. And this is so important, because often when we get hooked, when we see on Twitter or when people get really, upset about something, and it's like they're upset because their values have been contravened, mm-hmm. but they're operating out of their rage rather than into their values.
Yes.
And when you operate out of your rage, you actually are very often going against your values.
That's right.
You often are now breaking down communication. Mm-hmm. And so I love this notion from Nelson Mandela, because it was this idea of, I'm not turning away from my anger. I'm learning from my anger, and it's the learning about my values that allows me to then have the conversations that I need to have in order to create change.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah. Because the emotions, in a way, and I wrote this down as we were preparing for this episode, emotions are like children. You can love them without letting them run the show.
Yes, emotions are data, not directives. I can show up to my son's frustration with his baby sister. My son's more introverted and he needs his space, and his baby sister loves climbing on his head while he's reading. I can show up to my son's frustration with his baby sister. I can see it. I can sawubona it. I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. I can do all of those things. It doesn't mean I'm endorsing his idea that he gets to give her away to the first stranger he sees in a shopping mall.
That's right.
We own our emotions. They don't own us.
Did you enjoy this standalone Patreon highlight? If so, you can listen to full episodes of the Minimalist Private Podcast, available exclusively on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/theminimalists or click the link in the description. Your support keeps our podcast and YouTube channel 100% advertisement free.